The first thing you need to do is cut the fiberglass cloth. You have a razor wheel for cutting the cloth, which is extremely sharp. So put on the Kevlar glove, then lay the template on the cloth and try to orient the fibers in one direction as best you can. Then apply a little pressure and glide the razor wheel over the cloth to cut it. Remove the Kevlar glove and set the template aside. Then use a wood stick to lift the cloth up. The cloth will fray very easily. Before laying the cloth into the mold, remove any extra epoxy debris or make sure it's nice and clean. Also, recess the set screws so they're flush with the mold. Notice how the set screws are flush. These set screws will be used to push the part out when you're done next week. Carry the fiberglass cloth over to your workbench and carefully lay the cloth into the mold itself on the bottom side, which has dowel pins. Try to ensure all the fibers are within the mold cavity. If they extend beyond the cavity, the epoxy tends to leak through this path. The stick is usually a good way to lay it in. Then put the cover onto the bottom side and align the dowel pins. Each mold has 10 screws to secure it. Just insert the screws first. And be careful that none of the screws are fouled with epoxy resin. This will screw up the mold terribly, so if you find these, throw them away. You're going to want to tighten up each screw by hand. Don't over tighten them, just snug them up. I don't know how to tell you, but keep it snug but not too tight. Lastly, you want to put a strip of masking tape on your mold and identify with the section number and one of your teammates' name or some way of identifying this is your mold. Now that your mold is labeled, you'll want to set it on its side on a piece of wood. This will allow air to escape as you inject the epoxy into the mold. In parallel to the mold prep, teammates can prepare the epoxy. You first grab a syringe and extract the plunger. Then insert one of the red tips or plugs into the tip of the syringe. Set the syringe down and pick up a mixing cup and dispense 2 pumps of epoxy and then 2 pumps of the hardener. Both are metered automatically to provide you with the proper mix. Then use a tongue depressor and gently fold the mixture together. You don't want to agitate it too much or you'll have air bubbles. After the epoxy has been sufficiently mixed and blended, wipe off the wooden compressor and lay it on the table or throw it out. And then you're going to fill the barrel of the syringe. You want at least 30 milliliters of epoxy mixture. You want to be gentle at this point because if you pour it too quickly, you're going to cause bubbles to form. Next step is to put this in the bell jar, and we're going to create a vacuum to try to mitigate the bubbles. Your GSI will probably handle this portion of the lab. We leave it in there for about 5 minutes, but you can see the bubbles are moving toward the top in this example. Okay, after 5 minutes, the GSI can turn off the vacuum pump and then vent the bell jar, and this will allow you to remove the lid. Extract your syringe and go back to your workbench. At your workbench, you're going to remove the red plug and set it aside, and then insert the syringe into the lower part of the mold. Usually gravity is sufficient to pull this through. It does take a while, but you don't want to be too fast. If the epoxy seems to stagnate, you can use the plunger, but be gentle. You want to inject the epoxy extremely slow, otherwise you're going to have air bubbles. Usually you can just insert it and it gets the flow going. In this case, we're just going to inject it all the way. Todd's going much too fast at this point, but this is just an example. Keep your eye on the upper port for the epoxy to flow through, and then slow down. At this point, you can remove the syringe barrel, but you do want to inject a little bit of epoxy into that reservoir to keep it covered. Clean up your workstation and throw out the mixing cup and also the syringe. And finally, put the red plug back in the cup.